From the News Channel 5 Network, this is MorningLine with Nick Barris.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us on MorningLine. Nick Barris coming to you on a Thursday. And as always, a good show on tap for you. We're going to open up the phone lines. If you're watching us right now on the Plus, you know you're on TV, sitting at home, enjoying it. You can also follow us on Facebook at newschannel5.com. We'll be streaming live on Facebook, and we've got two guests, separate portions of the show today from Vanderbilt University, and we're going to be talking, I think, about some subjects I think you'll find interesting, again, related to the pandemic. But I think some of these, especially our first guest, who I'll introduce to you in a moment, the question of what's true or false. When we see the news about COVID-19, how can you do your best to believe and to understand what you're getting is the most accurate information? We've heard there have been questions sometimes about the numbers out there, on the numbers of tests positive and the number of people being tested. Other questions about, treatments and a lot of folks sometimes will claim false news. We know that COVID to some degree has become politicized. We know there are some people that just for whatever reason choose to ignore some of the medical advice and say, well, to heck with masks and social distancing. And they may point to some other sources there that tell them that's the okay thing to do. So everyone has a different take on where they come from, and you need to do your best to satisfy yourself that you're getting information that's credible, that protects you, your family, and, let's face it, everyone else in society. After our first guest from Vanderbilt, who I'll introduce to you in a moment, we'll be joined by a second guest who is really on the forefront right now of what's happening in pandemic research into the vaccines. And there have been a lot of new developments with regard to vaccines, things that we've learned about how COVID reacts, whether or not a vaccine, if it comes along, will help long term, or if it's more of a short term, type of thing, and where we stand on getting one in place. You saw yesterday the U.S. government has cut a deal in the billions of dollars with Pfizer to start producing doses of a vaccine once it becomes approved and ready to go, hopefully by December. We're going to get into all of that with the second guest from Vanderbilt, who's on the front lines of the vaccine research. But starting things off with the whole idea of getting details true and false, and you can call in or you can message us on Facebook. We're joined now by Assistant Professor of Psychology over at Vanderbilt, Lisa Fazio. Good morning to you, Professor. Can you hear me all right, ma'am?
Can hear you.
Okay, there we go. At first I didn't hear you. Now I've got you. Just want to make sure we've got it. Let me ask you this. All right, so you actually, I think, do research and have tried to come up with some suggestions for individuals, the idea of what's true or false when it comes to COVID-19. Give me an idea of how you're looking at this and how you approach that.
Yeah, so my research focuses on human memory, and I'm really interested in how people learn true and false information from the world around them. So how do people come to believe false information, and what can we do to prevent that and to correct it? So in the lab, we've been working on what are the interventions people can do to notice false information, to avoid it, and not to believe it.
Okay.
And one of the things that we found.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so what we found ends up being really effective is if people, when they first see something new, if all they do is pause and think about, how do I know that this is true or false? So when you see a headline on social media, when you see a post from a friend of a friend, kind of before you share it, before you have this immediate emotional reaction to it, pause and just think about how you might know if it's true or false.
Now, have you found in the research, because I'm looking at some of the posts here right off the bat, and many of them that I see on Facebook right off the bat, you can just tell. I mean, it's politicized right off the bat. It's as though if people come across information that maybe is coming from, say, a credible doctor, okay, and when I say credible, well, Nick, how do you know they're credible? Well, if you're a doctor who has the background, you see the resume at Vanderbilt or otherwise, and the numbers or the information is being given them doesn't square with what they want to believe, they tend to discount it. And I understand. I mean, they have another point of view maybe, and they want the facts to fit their point of view. How do you get past something like that?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. One thing we found is that it is worth correcting others on social media. This isn't research that I've done, but that my colleagues have done, finding that if someone you know is posting something that's definitely false, you've seen fact checks about it, you've seen journalists talking about how this isn't a credible source, this is false information, it's useful to respond with a link to that fact check. It's useful to post it. Even if you can't convince the original poster that they were wrong, what you do is create a kind of a credible record there in social media. And so everyone else who sees the post is seeing this corrected fact and isn't being misled.
Okay, so I've got Mikey here, okay? Guys like Mikey drive me nuts. He says COVID is a lie. The deaths, testing cases, it's all fake to scare people. I don't know what planet Mikey lives on, but when you have people posting stuff like that, I mean, look, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I think what you do is respond and say, I disagree, and here's a link to a post describing why what you're saying is false. Here's why you should believe the numbers. One thing that it's important to keep in mind is it's much more effective to give people the correct information rather than to just say, no, you're wrong. So rather than say, no, that's not right, it'd be better to explain, here's how the numbers come across. Here's what the doctors are doing. Here's why that's kind of the correct way to be counting them, and give people something else to believe.
All right, and I don't know, when I try to look into some of the information, I try not to go to, does it help in terms of getting the truth or, fiction from something? If you hear something or you see a story, what I tend to do, especially if it's something new, I don't just go to one source. That may be an initial source I consider to be credible, but I try to look and go to a variety of sources out there that I think are credible and see if I can find a consensus. And if I go across the line there and I see that the vast majority seem to be finding the same thing, that tends to make me feel more comfortable with it. Not that sometimes the lone voice in the wind could be the one that's right and everyone else wrong, but in general, does it help to look for a consensus?
It does. My number one tip for people when they find something that they're not sure if it's true or false is to grab the headline or some keywords, throw it into Google, and see what else pops up. Typically, if it's something false that's been around for a while, the first few things you see will be fact checks talking about why that's incorrect. And if it's true, what you should see is a number of sources all saying the same thing. So a number of reputable news organizations or other trustworthy sources telling you that, yeah, this information is true. It's rare that there'll be a new story on vaccines or the science or anything like that that isn't covered by multiple sources.
Can you give me, I don't want to put you too much on the spot, but maybe an example of in some of your research where you saw either a case along that where you did the multiple source search to maybe give an example for folks how you determined it, or maybe some of these other cases that you've looked at in terms of helping to understand and come to the determination whether or not something's true or false? Anyone come off the top of your head with regard to some of the testing numbers, maybe some of the cases we've seen, things like that?
I think a good one is this idea that masks disrupt your own breathing or trap CO2, things like that. At this point, if you throw that into Google, the first few hits you get will all be explainers talking about why that isn't the case. And how if it was, then you wouldn't have surgeons wearing masks for 12-hour surgeries and still being at the top of their game, and just how that isn't actually how it works.
I think that's a great example. I know one of your colleagues there at Vanderbilt the other day, Dr. Schaffner, really addressed that issue in the same way. It's interesting. Again, I see some people on Facebook here, addressing the issue, saying, some of these people who post it, if you want to respond to it, as you said, I don't want to get into arguments with people. And some of these folks that are so outlandish in their beliefs, I know I have no chance whatsoever of changing their mind anyway. But if they are posting something, I guess the idea is then maybe post something else out there, not so much for them, but for others who may see it, to say, look, you can see what this person's saying, fine, but check out these other places to try to get another point of view.
Exactly. I think that's what's most beneficial. If it's someone that you know personally and know that they are going to be reasonable, then great. Have a deep conversation with them. Try and understand where they're coming from and see if you guys can kind of see each other's point of view and come to a consensus. But if it's someone that you know isn't going to argue productively or is just going to kind of troll you, then post a link to the correct information so other people who come across it will know that there are other views and move on.
You know, and that's good. And Ted asks a good question, because this comes too for the guest. He asks, what's the best way to avoid the backfire effect in people who feel differently? I mean, it's one thing, you know, sometimes where if you can get back and forth and argue, you know, different, you know, perceived facts, that's fine. But a lot of this just gets ugly. They're going to attack you. They're going to say something that I put out there where I'm just reporting, you know, the numbers that I'm getting from the CDC or I'm getting from Dr. Fauci, who a lot of people think, because it's been politicized, doesn't know what he's talking about, which is ridiculous. And then they'll attack me, you know, or they'll say, oh, liberal media, or it's fake news. And, you know, with that, I mean, is there any way to mitigate that?
I think at that point, you just bow out. Like, you've posted the correct information there, and you can just take yourself out of the conversation. One thing I do think it's important to point out is a few years ago, there was a study that showed that when you presented people who strongly believed in a myth with evidence that they were wrong, they would sometimes double down and kind of believe that myth further. More recent research has shown that that's actually very rare. That most of the time when you present people with information, it either doesn't change their belief or it makes them more likely to believe the correct information. It's very rare that you'll actually get this backfire effect where they believe it more after you've corrected them.
Interesting. I guess the bottom line on this, we have a large planet with a lot of diversity and a lot of different opinions on this, and you know, some people are not going to change, others will, but just you know, I guess my point is just keep, you know, going and fighting the fight and don't give up, you know, one way or the other as it goes, and just accept the fact that there's going to be different points of view.
Yeah, and it's important to note that in some ways the game is rigged, where people who are fighting for the truth have to deal with a complicated world, and a world where science is constantly learning new things. The recommendations may change as time goes on and we get a better understanding of this virus. Whereas if you're peddling false information, you don't have to be constrained by the truth. And so you can come up with this really clean, easy story that's comforting, that people want to believe. And so in that way, it really is kind of a rigged fight in dealing with false information and the truth.
Yeah. Well, listen, I really appreciate you coming on this morning. It's something worth talking about, Professor Fazio. Yeah, just do your best to get the information that you understand and seek out the resources for it and have a conversation about it like we just did. Thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it, Professor.
Thank you. Have a good day.
All right, we're going to take a break. When we do come back, we will be joined by another professor, a doctor over at Vanderbilt. Many of you are asking questions already, and I know some of you, and this is a question I have for you. They're fast-tracking right now work on a vaccine. If and when that vaccine does come out, especially if it was fast-tracked, will you go get it? I mean, how confident will you be that it is a safe vaccine? I have to believe that maybe if they're making it public and they go with it, it's going to be, but are you going to be on board with that? A vaccine that works will be a wonderful, wonderful thing, but where do we stand on that? And we'll ask that question and more of one of the individuals that's on the front lines of creating a vaccine when we come back right after this.